Then, as Kay was just in the middle of a long swig, everything became bright. The electric lights blazed inside, on the stairs, in the passages, in the entrance hall, outside above the door. Steps could be heard coming down the stairs. The flask fell from Kay's hand. The brandy was spilt over a rug. Kay sprang out of the sledge. He had just time to slam the door, which made a loud noise. Then a gentleman came slowly out of the house. The only consolation that remained was that it was not Clam. Or was that rather not a pity? It was the gentleman whom Kay had already seen at the window on the first floor. A young man, very good-looking, pink and white, but very serious. Kay, too, looked at him gravely, but his gravity was on his own account. Really, he would have done better to have sent his assistants here. They couldn't have behaved more foolishly than he had done. The gentleman still regarded him in silence, as if he had not enough breath in his overcharged bosom for what had to be said. "This is unheard of," he said at last, pushing his hat a little back on his forehead. "What next?" The gentleman knew nothing, apparently, of Kay's stay in the sledge, and yet found something that was unheard of. Perhaps that Kay had pushed his way in as far as the courtyard. "How do you come to be here?" the gentleman asked, more softly now, breathing freely again, resigning himself to the inevitable. What questions to ask, and what could one answer? Was Kay to admit simply and flatly to this man that his attempt began with so many hopes, had failed? Instead of replying, Kay turned to the sledge, opened the door, and retrieved his cap, which he had forgotten there. He noticed with discomfort that the brandy was dripping from the footboard. Then he turned again to the gentleman. To show him that he had been in the sledge gave him no more compunction now. Besides, that wasn't the worst of it. When he was questioned, but only then, he would divulge the fact that the coachman himself had at least asked him to open the door of the sledge. But the real calamity was that the gentleman had surprised him, that there had not been enough time left to hide from him, so as afterwards to wait in peace for Clam, or rather, that he had not had enough presence of mind to remain in the sledge, close the door, and wait there among the rugs for Clam, or at least to stay there as long as this man was about. True, he couldn't know, of course, whether it might not be Clam himself who was coming, in which case it would naturally have been much better to accost him outside the sledge. Yes, there had been many things here for thought, but now there was none, for this was the end. "Come with me," said the gentleman. Not really as a command, for the command lay not in the words, but in a slight, studially indifferent gesture of the hand which accompanied them. I'm waiting here for somebody, said Kay, no longer in the hope of any success, but simply on principle. Come, said the gentleman once more, quite imperturbably, as if he wanted to show that he had never doubted that Kay was waiting for somebody. But then I would miss the person I'm waiting for, said Kay, with an emphatic nod of his head. In spite of everything that had happened, he had the feeling that what he had achieved thus far was something gained, which it was true he only held now in seeming, but which he must not relinquish all the same merely on the account of a polite command. You'll miss him in any case, whether you go or stay, said the gentleman, expressing himself bluntly, but showing an unexpected consideration for Kay's line of thought. Then I would rather wait for him and miss him, said Kay defiantly. He would certainly not be driven away from here by the mere talk of this young man. Thereupon, with his head thrown back and a supercilious look on his face, the gentleman closed his eyes for a few minutes, as if he wanted to turn from Kay's senseless stupidity to his own sound reason again, ran the tip of his tongue around his slightly parted lips, and said at last to the coachman, "Unyoke the horses." Obedient to the gentleman, but with a furious side glance at Kay, the coachman had now to get down in spite of his fur coat, and began very hesitatingly, as if he did not so much expect a counter-order from the gentleman as a sensible remark from Kay, to back the horses and the sledge closer to the side wing, in which apparently behind a big door was the shed where the vehicles were kept. Kay saw himself deserted. The sledge was disappearing in one direction, in the other, by the way he had come himself. The gentleman was receding, both, it was true, very slowly, as if they wanted to show Kay that it was still in his power to call them back. Perhaps he had this power, but it would have availed him nothing. To call the sledge back would be to drive himself away. So he remained standing as one who held the field, but it was a victory which gave him no joy. Alternately, he looked at the backs of the gentleman and the coachman. The gentleman had already reached the door through which Kay had first come into the courtyard. Yet once more he looked back. Kay fancied he saw him shaking his head over such obstinacy. Then with a short, decisive, final movement, he turned away and stepped into the hall, where he immediately vanished. The coachman remained for a while still in the courtyard. He had a great deal of work with the sledge. He had to open the heavy door of the shed, back the sledge into place, unyoke the horses, lead them to their stalls. All this he did gravely, with concentration, evidently without any hope of starting soon again. And this silent absorption which did not square a single side glance for Kay, seemed to the latter a far heavier reproach than the behavior of the gentleman. And when now, after finishing his work in the shed, the coachman went across the courtyard in his slow, rolling walk, closed the gate, and then returned, all very slowly, while he literally looked at nothing but his own footprints in the snow, and finally shut himself into the shed. And now, as all the electric lights went out too, for whom should they remain on? And only up above the slit in the wooden gallery still remained bright, holding one's wandering gaze for a little. It seemed to Kay as if at last those people had broken off all relations with him, and as if now in reality he were freer than he had ever been, and at liberty to wait here, in this place usually forbidden to him, as long as he desired. He'd won freedom, such as hardly anybody else had ever succeeded in winning, and as if nobody could dare touch him or drive him away or even speak to him. But this conviction was at least equally strong, as if at the same time there was nothing more senseless, nothing more hopeless than this freedom, this waiting, this inviolability.